Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corn. So we had an interesting episode about VHB tape, and it's going to seem like the most obscure and boring topic. VHB tape, for those who haven't come across the wonderful product, is a type of adhesive tape made by 3M. VHB stands for very high bond strength. And I mentioned Herman and Corn that I came across this after reaching a breaking point of frustration as a renter, taping stuff up, having it fall down from the local stuff in the hardware store. And I asked ChatGPT, what is the strongest tape known to mankind that I can just buy and get this whatever I want to adhere? And VHB was the answer. And I bought a couple of test rolls because it's quite expensive. And it was love at first application. After the first two rolls, Hannah's laughing. After the first two rolls were consumed, I got myself a stock. And something really interesting that came out of the last episode, because I asked you, is it true? VHB tape is kind of legendary. I read that the Burj Khalifa, that they actually used it to hang glass, and IKEA. And we got into this discussion about application, because most of us if you've tried to apply this stuff, you've probably read you need to prep your surfaces. We talked about heat being really helpful, but when you can, when the stuff bonds, the first time I got it to bond so strongly that I couldn't take it off. I have a mini PC and I was trying to get it in my networking cabinet, and that was my first. Oh, that was when I became a VHB believer, because I've tried to yank that off and I'm not able to. So you can actually bond something, and you mentioned that VHB or 3M in their internal testing had run some tests where they couldn't. Metal broke. They managed to bond two sheets of metal together, and metal broke before the tape did. You mentioned that from a structural standpoint, adhesives actually kind of make more sense, because if we're using a nail, it's all the force is concentrated. And you mentioned as well that in aviation and increasingly other applications, it sounds so dodgy to have something like a skyscraper where the glass is held up with tape. But if we just change our conception and we stop thinking of tape as sellotape and think of it as high grade bonding, then it can really change things, and it can very much empower us as renters. I'm looking at Ezra with my headphones on his head. Anyway, Herman and Corn, I'll cut to the chase. I've become a adhesive believer, and because this stuff is kind of hard to find locally, I'm doing a stock up order on VHB. And whenever I ask ChatGPT about specific tapes, adhesive tapes for specialist applications, I discover that there's a whole world out there of tapes. There's ones for rated for up to 60 degrees Celsius, so stuff that you can actually use in your car, because it's rated, and I think it's rated down to negative 90 degrees. So basically, it's not going to melt or freeze. You've got stuff that is like really waterproof. You've got stuff that is really UV resistant. And I'm talking all about the different tapes within the 3M series. Some of it is explicitly within their VHB line. Some of it isn't. So Herman and Corn, for those who like me maybe are after a lifetime of using pretty crappy tapes from the hardware store, we're discovering that there's actually these incredible tapes on the market that if you just know how to use them, you can get bonds that are actually stronger than screws. I'm very excited by this. So I'd love to get an overview of the different types of high grade tapes that are out there. In the 3M series, I know they typically have 4-digit identifiers. And the other question, Herman and Corn, is I know from buying some of these on AliExpress that there's definitely a market for, let's say fake tape. So if one was looking to buy the good stuff, authentic 3M tape, it's actually kind of hard to find this stuff. When I was looking for VHB, in Israel. I ended up getting some from AliExpress that I assume is a counterfeit of some kind or another. But when I was looking for real 3M tape, it was these kind of obscure. They found like one hardware store in the country that had it, so it's not something you see necessarily off the rack of your local hardware store. So where do you actually get, whether you're, I'm not talking about specific stores, but if you're looking for the type of store that's going to stock authentic, really good quality adhesive tape, what kind of place are you buying from? Is it a sort of electronic, IT supplier, automotive supplier? Where does one go to get a good quality tape collection?
Hey everyone, welcome back to my weird prompts. I am Corn, and honestly, I'm feeling a little bit more secure today. And by secure, I mean literally bonded to my seat.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I suspect you are making a very specific reference to the audio clip our housemate Daniel sent over this morning.
I am indeed. Daniel has been on a bit of a journey lately, hasn't he? It started with him trying to hang those heavy acoustic panels in his room with what I can only describe as glorified school glue sticks, and now he is diving deep into the world of industrial-grade adhesives.
It is the natural progression of a frustrated renter, Corn. You start with the blue mounting putty, you move to the command strips, and when those inevitably fail because you're trying to mount a mini computer or a heavy mirror, you start looking for the heavy hitters. And in the world of sticky things, there is one name that stands above all others.
3M. Specifically, their VHB line. Very high bond.
Exactly. And Daniel really hit the nail on the head, or rather, the tape on the substrate with this one. He wants to know about the 4-digit codes, the ratings, the environmental resistance, and most importantly, how to make sure you are not buying a cheap knockoff that is going to drop your expensive electronics on the floor in the middle of the night.
I think this is a perfect topic for us because it is one of those things that seems boring on the surface, but once you realize that the skyscrapers we see every day are quite literally held together with this stuff, it becomes fascinating. So, Herman, let us start with the big picture. What makes VHB different from the double-sided tape you buy at the grocery store?
It comes down to chemistry and physics. Standard double-sided tape is usually a thin carrier-like paper, tissue, or plastic with a thin layer of adhesive on both sides. If the carrier tears, the bond fails. VHB is what we call a closed-cell acrylic foam. The tape itself is the adhesive. It is a viscoelastic material.
Viscoelastic. That is a great word. Break that down for us.
Think of it as a material that behaves like both a liquid and a solid. When you apply pressure, it flows like a liquid into the microscopic peaks and valleys of the surface you are sticking it to. That is the viscosity. But then, it resists deformation like a solid. That is the elasticity. Because it flows into those tiny gaps, you get a much higher surface area of contact than you would with a stiff tape. That is why the bond is so incredibly strong. It is not just sitting on top of the surface, it is essentially becoming one with it at a molecular level through van der Waals forces.
And Daniel mentioned the Burj Khalifa. Is it true? Is that building actually held together with tape?
It is. They use VHB tape to bond the glass panels to the aluminum frames on the exterior of the building. This is called structural glazing. Think about the wind loads at the top of the tallest building in the world. Think about the extreme heat of the desert sun causing the metal to expand and the glass to stay relatively stable. If they used mechanical fasteners like screws or rivets, every single hole they drilled would be a point of stress concentration. The metal would eventually crack around the hole. But with tape, the stress is distributed evenly across the entire surface of the bond. Plus, it acts as a seal against water and air. It has been used in everything from the wings of airplanes to the panels on the side of ambulances.
That is wild. Okay, so let us get into the weeds for Daniel. He asked about the 4-digit identifiers. When you look at the 3M catalog, it looks like a sea of numbers. 4910, 5952, 4941. It feels like secret code. How do we decode this?
It is a bit of a system, though it has evolved over 40 years, so there are some inconsistencies. Generally, the first 2 digits tell you the family of the tape, and the last 2 digits often refer to the thickness in mils, which is thousandths of an inch, or they are just a sequential identifier.
Okay, let us start with the big families. What are the heavy hitters?
The classic one is the 4900 series. This is the firm acrylic foam family. If you see a tape like 4910, that is the clear one. It is iconic. It is 1 millimeter thick, completely transparent, and very firm. It is great for glass-to-glass applications where you do not want to see the tape. But because it is firm, it needs very flat surfaces to work.
But firmness has a downside, right? If it is firm, it does not conform as well to rough surfaces.
Exactly. That is why we have the 4941 family. These are multi-purpose acrylic foams. They are a bit softer, usually gray, and they are designed to conform to slightly irregular surfaces. If you are bonding two pieces of metal that are not perfectly flat, or maybe have a slight texture, you want 4941 over 4910. It is much more forgiving.
What about the one everyone seems to recommend for automotive work? I see 5952 mentioned a lot.
The 5900 series is the modern superstar of the VHB world. It is a modified acrylic. The big advantage here is that it is designed to bond to a wider variety of surfaces, including most powder-coated paints and even some plastics that are traditionally hard to stick to. If you are not sure exactly what the surface energy of your material is, the 5900 series is usually the safest bet. It is very conformable, very black, and very aggressive. It is the go-to for attaching trim to cars or mounting electronics in a dashboard.
You mentioned surface energy. We should probably explain that, because it is the reason why Daniel might find that his tape sticks to a piece of steel, but falls right off a plastic bin.
This is crucial. Think of surface energy like the stickiness of the surface itself at a molecular level. High surface energy materials like stainless steel, copper, or glass are easy to bond to. The adhesive wants to wet out across them. Low surface energy materials, or LSE materials, are things like polyethylene, polypropylene, or Teflon. They are like a freshly waxed car water, just beads up on them, and so does adhesive.
So if Daniel is trying to stick something to a plastic dashboard or a storage bin, he needs to be looking at specific series.
Right. He would want something like the LSE series, specifically the LSE 110 or LSE 160. These were released fairly recently to solve the problem of sticking to those greasy-feeling plastics without needing a chemical primer. If he uses a 4900 series tape on a low-energy plastic, it will probably peel right off like a Post-it note.
What about the RP series? I see that one popping up as a more affordable option.
RP stands for right performance. It is basically 3M's way of saying you do not always need the extreme specs of the 5900 series. It is an all-purpose gray tape. It is great for general signage or light-duty mounting. It is a bit cheaper, but it does not have the same extreme temperature or chemical resistance as the flagship lines.
Okay, let us talk about the ratings Daniel asked about. Temperature resistance is a big one, especially in a place like Jerusalem where the sun can be brutal, or for someone using it in a car.
3M gives two different temperature ratings, long-term and short-term. Long-term usually means days or weeks, while short-term means minutes or hours. For most of the classic VHB tapes, the long-term limit is around 200 degrees Fahrenheit or about 93 degrees Celsius.
That is actually quite high. Most cars sitting in the sun will not get much hotter than that on the interior surfaces, right?
It can get close. A black dashboard in the summer can hit 180 degrees Fahrenheit, so you are pushing the limits, but you are usually safe. However, if you are doing something industrial, like putting a piece through a powder coating oven, you need the GPH series. That stands for General Purpose High Temperature. Those can handle short-term spikes up to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, that is 230 degrees Celsius.
Wow. So you could literally bake the tape in an oven and it would hold?
Yes, it is designed specifically for those manufacturing processes. Now, on the cold side, Daniel mentioned minus 90 degrees. Most VHB tapes are rated down to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit or Celsius. That is where the scales meet, for long-term exposure. They do not really get brittle, they just get stiffer. The bond actually stays very strong in the cold, but you have to apply the tape when it is warm.
That is a key point. You can't just go out to your car in the middle of a freeze, slap some tape on, and expect it to work.
Absolutely not. The magic of the liquid flow we talked about, the wetting out, needs heat. 3M recommends applying the tape at room temperature, ideally between 60 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Once it is bonded and cured for 72 hours, then you can take it into the Arctic or the desert. But that initial bond needs warmth to flow into those microscopic pores.
What about UV exposure and waterproofing? Daniel is worried about stuff falling off if it gets rained on.
Acrylic, which is what VHB is made of, is naturally very resistant to UV light. Unlike rubber-based adhesives that turn yellow and brittle in the sun, VHB can live outside for decades. And as for waterproofing, it is a closed-cell foam. That means water cannot move through the tape. If you apply a continuous bead of VHB around a window or a panel, you have created a permanent waterproof gasket. It is used in boat building and for sealing the roofs of semi-trucks for this exact reason. It is also resistant to most common solvents, fuels, and even salt water.
So it is basically a structural glue, a gasket, and the vibration dampener all in one.
Exactly. That vibration dampening is another reason it is used in cars and airplanes. It absorbs the energy between the two surfaces instead of letting it rattle them apart. It prevents what we call galvanic corrosion too. If you have two different metals, like aluminum and steel, touching each other, they will corrode. VHB keeps them separated with a physical barrier while still holding them together.
Okay, let us pivot to the practical side. Daniel is worried about counterfeits, and honestly, I am too. If I go on a major discount website and see a roll of VHB for $5 when the official site says it is $30, my alarm bells are going off.
And they should be. Counterfeit tape is a massive problem in 2026. The fake stuff is often just cheap rubber-based foam tape with a red liner that looks like the 3M liner. But the chemistry is completely different. It will work for a week, and then the oils in the plastic or the heat of the sun will cause the adhesive to turn into a gooey mess and your project will fail.
So how does a regular person like Daniel ensure they are getting the real deal?
First, look at the liner. Authentic VHB almost always has a very specific red film liner with the 3M VHB logo printed on it. But fakes are getting better at mimicking that. The real test is the smell and the texture. Authentic VHB has a very faint, slightly sweet chemical smell, not a pungent rubber smell, and the foam itself should feel dense and snappy. If it feels like a squishy kitchen sponge, or if you can see big air bubbles in the foam, it is fake.
But you should probably avoid the sketchy sellers entirely. Daniel asked if he should look for specialized automotive or electronic suppliers. What is your take?
He is absolutely right. Local hardware stores are a crapshoot. They might carry one or two types of 3M tape, but it is often the consumer-grade mounting tape, which is not true industrial VHB. If you want the real stuff, you go to authorized industrial distributors.
Give us some names. Who are the big players?
In the United States, you have Grainger, McMaster Carr, or Uline. Those are the gold standards for industrial supplies. For electronics specifically, DigiKey and Mouser are fantastic. They sell the tape in smaller quantities or even pre-cut shapes, which is great for hobbyists. In Europe, you have RS Components or Farnell. These companies have direct supply chains from 3M.
And what about here in Israel, or for international listeners?
You want to look for local companies that specialize in industrial adhesives or signage supplies. Sign makers use a ton of VHB for mounting letters to buildings. If you find a shop that sells to sign makers, you are going to find the good stuff. Also, check for the 3M certified distributor logo on their website.
That is a great tip. I never thought about sign makers.
They are the hidden experts of the adhesive world. Now, Daniel also mentioned AliExpress and other major global marketplaces. I love a good bargain as much as the next guy, but I would never ever buy VHB on a site like that. The risk of getting a counterfeit is nearly 100%. It is just not worth the savings when the failure could mean a $500 mini PC hitting the floor.
It is the classic case of being penny wise and pound foolish. You save $20 on tape and lose hundreds on the hardware.
Exactly. And there is one more thing Daniel needs to know about buying: the shelf life. VHB does not last forever in the roll. Usually it has a shelf life of about 24 months from the date of manufacture if stored in cool, dry conditions. If you buy from a reputable distributor, they rotate their stock. If you buy from a random seller on a marketplace, you might be getting a roll that has been sitting in a hot warehouse for 5 years.
So, check the date code on the inside of the core.
Yes, there is usually a lot number on the cardboard core. You can actually look that up or contact 3M to see when it was made. If the core is plain white with no markings, that is another red flag for a counterfeit.
Okay, so we have talked about the tape itself, but I feel like we need to talk about the application process. Because you can have the best tape in the world, but if you do not prep the surface, it is going to fail. Daniel mentioned he had stuff falling down. I bet it was a prep issue.
It almost always is. People think they can just wipe the dust off with their hand and stick the tape on. That is a recipe for disaster. You need the 3 C's, clean, conform, and cure. But I like to add a fourth one, condition.
Walk us through them.
Clean is the most important. You need a 50-50 mixture of isopropyl alcohol and water. Not Windex, not soap and water. Those leave residues or perfumes that act as a barrier. Isopropyl alcohol dissolves the oils from your fingerprints and any factory grease on the surface. You wipe it until the cloth comes away clean. If the surface is really greasy, you might need a stronger solvent first, like heptane, but always finish with the alcohol.
And what about the condition part?
That is for the difficult surfaces. Sometimes you need to lightly abrade the surface with a Scotch-Brite pad to increase the surface area, and for some plastics or painted surfaces, you need 3M Primer 94. It is a chemical bridge that makes the surface much more receptive to the adhesive. If Daniel is sticking things to a wall with cheap latex paint, Primer 94 is his best friend.
And what about the conform part?
That is the pressure. VHB is a pressure-sensitive adhesive. It does not just work by touching. You need to apply significant pressure, ideally with a J-roller, but a firm thumb will work for small stuff to force that viscoelastic foam into the pores of the surface. 3M recommends about 15 pounds of pressure per square inch.
That is actually quite a lot of pressure. You really have to lean into it.
You do. If you just tap it on, you only have about 10% surface contact. If you press it hard, you get close to 100%. And finally, the cure. This is the one that kills people's patience.
I know, I am guilty of this. You stick it on and immediately want to hang the heavy object.
And that is when it fails. At room temperature, it takes 20 minutes to reach 50% bond strength. It takes 24 hours to reach 90%, and it takes a full 72 hours to reach 100%. If Daniel is hanging a mini PC, he needs to tape the bracket to the wall, wait 3 days, and then mount the computer.
3 days? That feels like an eternity in the age of instant gratification.
It is, but if you want that bond to be stronger than a screw, you have to let the molecules do their work. They are literally crawling into the surface. Give them time to finish the journey. If you load it too early, the tape starts to peel, and once a peel starts, it is very hard to stop.
You know, it is interesting you mentioned the mini PC. Daniel said he tried to yank it off and couldn't. That suggests he actually got a good bond on that one. But then he had other things fall. It really shows how variable it can be based on the material.
It really does. And I want to touch on one thing Daniel said about the tape being stronger than screws. In many cases, that is literally true. If you join 2 pieces of thin sheet metal with a screw, the metal will often tear around the screw hole under high stress. But with VHB, the entire surface of the metal is sharing the load. The metal itself will often bend or snap before the tape lets go.
I have seen those videos on the 3M YouTube channel where they try to pull 2 plates apart with a crane and the steel just deforms. It is incredible.
It is. But there is a limit. VHB is amazing for shear strength, that is, sliding forces, and for tensile strength, pulling straight apart. What it is not great at is cleavage or peel forces.
Cleavage and peel. Sounds like a bad 80s band.
Haha! Cleavage is when you are prying from one edge, like if you put a screwdriver under the corner of the tape and lift. Peel is the same thing, pulling the tape back on itself. Because the foam is flexible, all that force gets concentrated on a tiny line at the edge. That is how you remove VHB, by the way. You don't pull it off, you use a cheese wire or a thin blade to cut through the foam core, and then you peel the remaining bits.
So if Daniel is mounting something, he needs to make sure the weight is pulling straight down or straight out, not prying at the top edge.
Exactly. If he is mounting a shelf that sticks out far from the wall, the weight of the books is going to create a prying force at the top of the bracket. That is a bad use case for tape, unless you have a very long vertical bracket to spread out that leverage.
This is all so practical. I feel like I need to go audit everything I have taped to the walls in our house now.
You probably should. And check the tape families. If you used 4910 on a powder-coated metal frame, it might be holding on by a thread.
Okay, so to recap for Daniel and everyone else, if you want the best all-around performer for modern materials, look for the 5900 series, like 5952. If you need it to be clear for glass, go 4900 series, like 4910. If you are dealing with high heat, look for GPH. And if you're sticking to difficult plastics like polyethylene, look for the LSE series.
And please buy from a real industrial supplier like Grainger or DigiKey. Avoid the $5 rolls on the discount sites. Your sanity and your hardware are worth more than that.
And don't forget the isopropyl alcohol and the 72-hour wait.
The 72 hours is the hardest part of the whole process. It is a test of character, really.
It truly is. Well, Herman, I think we have given Daniel enough information to turn his room into a permanent, unremovable fortress of technology.
Just remember, Daniel, if you ever move out, you might have to leave the mini PC attached to the wall. That bond is for life.
Or at least until the drywall gives way.
Exactly. The tape will hold, the paint on the wall might not. That is the ultimate irony of VHB. It is often stronger than the things it is sticking to.
That is a whole other episode. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. I love it when we can take something as mundane as tape and realize it is a marvel of material science.
It really is. It is the invisible glue of the modern world, literally.
Before we wrap up, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who has been listening. We have been doing this for over 500 episodes now, and the community that has grown around my weird prompts is just incredible. We love your questions, your feedback, and the way you all dive into these rabbit holes with us.
It really is the best part of the job. And hey, if you are enjoying the show and you haven't already, could you do us a huge favor? Hop over to your podcast app, whether that is Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and leave us a quick review or a rating. It sounds like a small thing, but it genuinely helps the algorithms find people who are just as nerdy as we are.
It really does make a difference. And if you want to see the show notes for this episode, or check out our full archive of over 500 episodes, you can find everything at myweirdprompts.com. We have an RSS feed there too if you want to subscribe directly.
And thanks again to Daniel for the prompt. I'm looking forward to seeing what he manages to stick to the ceiling next.
Hopefully not himself.
With VHB, it is a real possibility.
All right, that is it for today. Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. We will see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.